Davey D hanging out with you, and right now the entire planet is looking at the Middle East. They're looking at Gaza, they're looking at Israel, they're looking at the historic conflict that has existed between the two places that has once again flared up. And I wanted to talk to a good friend of ours. His name is Hatem Bazian. He is a professor at UC Berkeley who specializes in the Middle East. And I wanted to talk to you, Hatem, not just in terms of what's going on, we'll get into that, but there oftentimes, we live in a day and time where I call it the information age, where there's so much coming at us, people can't really make sense of it. It's coming from the left, coming from the right, coming in the middle, you know, it's coming across the computers, radio, what have you, and it's hard to shift through what is and what isn't. And I bring that up to say that when you have conflicts and you have people that hold power, in this information age, what you see is a rewriting of the narrative, and you see very slick framing of particular scenarios. So as Malcolm X said famously, you know, if you're not careful, the media will, you know, have you hating the victim and thinking the victim is actually, the aggressor is really the victim. And many people have looked at the situation in the Middle East and have come to that conclusion. They look at the word terrorism being applied to the Palestinians. They look at the framing of the conflict as if it's an equal-sided war, like they're in conflict. So it means that you got one army, you got the other army, and it's going back and forth, and and everybody suffering equal casualties. You have the type of conversation that suggests that the Palestinians have free autonomy, like they can go and come as they please. You know, they can close things off, they can grow their own food, do their own fishing, and all that sort of stuff. And the average person thinks that way, but obviously it's not. And I learned a lot from just hearing you speak over the years. So maybe if we can start from there. Paint a picture for us. What is going on in terms, what do we need to know about that region of the world? You know, what is Palestine?
Yeah. Well, I think, thanks David for having me in here. And it's been, you know, our conversation over the years have been always a pleasure, because we often been meeting on the road, in the protest, in the front line. But in order for us actually to just put a landscape, and we're coming into the Thanksgiving, and we understand the relationship between the indigenous population in here and the legacy that essentially ended transforming this land into what it is right now. So while people are going to celebrate Thanksgiving, some of us are going to be on Alcatraz being identified with the indigenous population, and we see the project of the Americas and what happened. So if we take that frame and apply it to Palestine, we're dealing with a colonial structure.
Okay.
And a colonial structure that has been put in place at the end of the First World War and throughout the 20th century into the 21st century. This colonial project that displaced, dispossessed, committed cultural genocide against the Palestinians, corralled them into the Gaza Strip, where 85% of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are refugees that have been uprooted from their lands, from their villages, from their cities, without any possession whatsoever.
Right.
So at the core piece of it is that we have a colonized and the colonizer.
Right.
And until we understand that frame to begin with, then the current conflict is only the margins or the notes, the cliff notes, on the major consequences of what took place over the 20th century.
Right. And if you don't see it from that framework, I would imagine, and when you see uprisings, then they stop becoming uprisings and they become acts of terror.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, and when you mention that, what comes to mind is how for a very long time the situation in South Africa was framed. So Nelson Mandela is in jail because he's a terrorist. The African National Congress are people that need to be hunted down because they are disrupting civil society. You know, and people bought into that for a very long time. And you're sitting there and you're going, wait a second, something don't sound right. But when you use those words and you repeat them, people who are casual observers of world politics tend to believe that.
Sure, and the thing is this notion of civil society, a civil society that does not include you.
Right.
And therefore in South Africa, the civil society had to be white civil society.
Right.
And therefore there is an erasure and an omission of the presence of the majority black population in South Africa.
Right.
Now, even taking it in here in this country, and this is something that I'm constantly weaving in and making links. When you get the report, 3 blacks killed in Auckland, that frame, while the black is being mentioned, is actually being omitted.
Right.
Because we don't have a name, we don't have a face, we don't have a history, we don't have the context, we don't have 300-400 years of links to what take place. So what you mention the number, it is actually obfuscating the reality of what took place. So you immediately dispense with actually thinking that something happened.
It's dehumanizing.
It's dehumanizing, it's erasing, it's actually omitting the context, which is very important, because if you use the passive voice, if you use the numbers, if you use the figure, essentially they don't exist. And if you think of the Palestinians, it's the same thing.
Right.
It's constantly erasing the culture, the society, the history, the individual, so we get the numbers without any context whatsoever. On the other hand, Israelis, they say, missiles are launched into Israel, and therefore there's lack of context in here. Israel have been assassinating Palestinians, have committed 1,800 airstrikes against a civilian population that is locked. So Gaza, you can't go out or into Gaza.
Right.
All entrances and exits are managed by Israel. Even the Rafah border with Egypt is actually managed through an agreement where Israel essentially has a final determination who comes in and out, what type of things can come in and out. So you have the largest open prison system.
Wait, so in other words, the borders mean that if you're Palestinian, you can't bring in certain things?
You can't.
Wow.
You can't, well, and that's why you have the Palestinians having tunnels underground in order to actually smuggle stuff, basic food. It's actually one unique thing. They're actually, in some circumstances, they smuggled brides that wanted to come and get married in Gaza Strip, so they actually had to smuggle a bride through the tunnels. So basic needs, basic requirements. They can bring in cement to construct their buildings. They can bring actually pencils where on those items that are restricted to be brought into Gaza because it has dual usage. So the notion that we get in here, which is essentially AIPAC speak,
AIPAC is the Israeli lobby.
The American Israel Public Affairs Committee. You get these congressmen, senators, and the political leadership resonating once again what the Israeli lobby is putting out and what the Israeli government, and therefore you sit back and you identify with the Israelis and you don't identify with the Palestinians. In a similar way that when we were watching cowboy movies, you identify with the cowboys and you don't identify with the Native Americans. It makes you feel that the Native Americans...
Because you don't know anything about the Native American. You don't know, you only know one name, Tonto.
Yeah, and you have this notion that these are the savages and these are the civilized. And it's interesting because we have this ad in San Francisco in the war between the civilized and the savage, side with the civilized support Israel. So you could even see these notions are reflected in our consciousness. And that's also, I would say, one part of this understanding. You cannot understand the Palestine-Israel conflict, and also you can understand some of the domestic politics in this country without having a very core understanding of colonialism, of racism, of critical race theory. Otherwise, you would begin to just think that these are the Hatfields and McCoys are just lobbing at each other without understanding the frames that are set in there and being part and parcel of the dynamics on the ground.
You know, Hatem, you know, one of the things that we often hear when discussing the conflict in the Middle East, and also just a larger part of information warfare, is the battle of false equivalence. So maybe you can point out how that plays itself out, but the way that I see this is that the false equivalent is that well, let me put it this way. I'll give an example where I saw the false equivalence was being in London the day that they had those bombings a few years ago. I was there that day. And when I went out to cover it, there was a lot of press there, but there was also press from the U.S. And when we went on the streets and we started asking people what we thought led up to these bombings, almost without fail, most of the people in London, from all walks of life, black, white, rich, young, poor, whatever, talked about foreign policy decisions of Tony Blair and George Bush. The American, ABC was one, Christian Science Monitor. They took that and then they went into the hotel and they searched until they found one American to say, "Oh, I think Al Qaeda had something to do with it." And when you saw the coverage, it was one person saying that it was Tony Blair and foreign policy and George Bush, and one person saying it was, Al Qaeda. And I asked, I said, well, everybody here is saying the other way. And the response was, well, these people are just too dumb, literally. And so this got broadcasted across the world. So now when you get back to the States, people are like, well, it must have been Al Qaeda. And these people are dumb because, if it was, the retort became, if it was really that overwhelming, then of course the newspapers would have shown the full thing, the false equivalent. But how does that play itself out? And I didn't mean to be long-winded, but I wanted to give a very real-life example with very real entities that we trust, ABC, and in this case, Christian Science Monitor, and how they did actual coverage.
Actually, there was a research on the foreign news that we get here in this country, and it turned out that almost 87% of the news that we get in this country is filtered through embassies and through our foreign policy establishment. So what we get essentially is almost the government version of state-sponsored news. The only difference is that the news already knows how to play the system, and they know exactly what type of news they need to put out. So when we are listening and seeing, the version of news that we are getting is essentially state-sponsored. And you could see the difference between CNN International,
right,
which projects on the international scene, versus CNN domestic. The difference is so stark that you would think that you're watching two different news outlets.
And because there's a political awareness in other places, they're not going for the okie doke.
Absolutely. Now, we understand, and Chomsky has said, manufacturing consent. The most important aspect in the conduct of war is getting and maintaining the support of the population,
right,
both in the United States, because we support Israel to the tune of $11 billion a year, and also for the Israelis to maintain that support, and for Europeans as well.
So we give them $11 billion a year.
$11 billion a year is everything, every rocket that we see, every airstrike that we see on Gaza, every tank that's there on the ground is provided support courtesy of our taxpayers' money, right, and therefore the link between foreign policy and our engagement with Israel, and that's this notion that the United States is neutral. When you give somebody a gun, you're no longer neutral.
Right.
The only difference is that you're not pulling the trigger. So essentially, we are involved and embedded, right, in the conflict for a number of reasons. One of it is that we are addicted to oil, and you would think that in the U.S. and in Europe, we often had this racism. We hate things that are black, but when it comes to oil, we love that which is black.
Right.
So there is a contradiction in terms of race
right,
issues. So there's so much commitment to try to maintain the oil, not only for ourselves, but also to leverage it against China, and also possibly against Europe. And that's why you see the same type of investment that are made in there, because of this strategic positioning. Domestically in the U.S., you have a very strong Israel lobby. You have a very influential political landscape that maintains every political aspect of our own society in lockstep behind Israel, and therefore that response prevents any type of articulation of a different notion, or empathize and sympathize with the Palestinians, who are under international law, are occupied people, that they have the right to resist their occupier. But in this case, we're actually supporting the occupier against the occupiers.
Right. Yeah, because they're terrorists.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Or quote unquote terrorists is the word that we use. Let me ask you this. Using your expertise, you're watching what is coming across on the TV and what the mainstream dialogue is. Give us 2 or 3 things that we absolutely need to keep in mind when discussing or observing and engaging this conflict, as it stands now. What do we absolutely need to understand? Is there a name of somebody we need to look out for? Is there an angle that we need to be aware that's being taken? Or is there a glaring omission that we need to...
I think I said the first frame is that we need to understand that this is a colonial struggle, anti-colonial struggle. And therefore, the Palestinians are a colonized people in the 21st century that are attempting to end their colonization.
Okay.
Second, the framing of the Palestinian as a terrorist also has to be dispensed with. Rather, the structure of occupation is the highest form of terrorism because it's terrorized everyone within the Palestinian society, and they are completely under the total domination of Israel from the sky, from the air, from the sea, 24/7.
Right.
Now, the third is also we need to understand Palestine, Gaza, as symbolic of a global movement, and I think this requires some elaboration. Palestine have been connected to the historical struggles in the Third World from the early part of the 20th century.
Okay.
From the 1940s, it's interesting that the beginning of the direct occupation of Palestine, especially, was 1947-48, the same time that apartheid came in.
Right.
And what we see is this alliance in the non-aligned movement, the struggle of the Third World people for freedom, for ending colonial period. Palestine has been connected to it. Now, as we move from
well, if we go back to 48, a few years later, you start to see colonized countries in Africa fighting for freedom.
Absolutely.
But South Africa is under oppression, and Palestine is under oppression.
And that's important because the ANC and the PLO were connected. And the question often is asked, where did the ANC military wing got its training? It got trained in the Palestinian camps, in Algeria, in Libya, in Lebanon, and in Syria and in Jordan. And therefore, when Nelson Mandela came to this country and Ted Koppel is sitting there in Nightline and criticizing him about his friendship with Yasser Arafat and Castro, Nelson Mandela, being magnanimous as he is, he said, you don't tell us who are our friends.
Right.
Because Ted Koppel and some of these bourgeoisie elite here that joined the anti-apartheid movement after Nelson Mandela got out of jail, all of a sudden wanted usurped the struggle that had been fought over for many years. And as such, what we're finding today is that Palestine is a touchstone for a global movement that connecting its local struggle with what is taking place in Palestine. So you see yesterday in Greece, hundreds of thousands were out on the street in solidarity with the Palestinians, not because they see themselves in different areas, but they understand that their own domestic and local struggle for economic viability, for economic well-being, is connected to the disposition of the Palestinians.
Right.
And similarly, you see in Venezuela and other places, and as such, it became one of those rallying touchstones in a similar way that South Africa became a touchstone for the movement in the 70s and 80s, and I think that recognition has to be understood when you see the Palestinian, that is the dynamics in there. And I often say that there is a Gaza in every city here in the U.S. because we're getting people dispossessed through the foreclosure, and we can make those connections to understand that we're dealing with a global movement that is rooted in attempting to change the politics of the status quo.
Well, appreciate that. That's a very, very good breakdown. My last question for you, and then when we're done, we're going to have a roundtable with some folks. But nowadays, looking at things through the colonial, colonizing lens is confusing because what we now have in 2012 are black and brown faces in high places who are just as brutal and just as oppressive as the original colonizers that we deal with. How do we start to parse through that? Because, one criticism has been that, that there is a certain amount of brutality within some people who want leadership and power in Palestine.
Sure, absolutely.
That has, repressed its own. We've seen, a turnaround in South Africa with the ANC. They come under a lot of critique. So how do we start to deal with that, and what makes the oppressed move into a mindset of being the oppressor?
Well, if you remember, I think Stephen Biko says that the most powerful weapons in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
Right.
And therefore, as we move into the post-colonial period, and we move into attempts to get rid of the military aspect of colonialism, we are still having the vestiges of colonialism, even in societies that have been achieved their liberation from military domination. They have not changed or altered the colonial structure in there. They did not change the colonial structure in education, which is the most critical aspect, because you could actually free yourself from the chains in the hands, but the chains on the brain and the mind is very, very difficult. So the education system is still Eurocentric across the globe, even in many of the colonial, the ex-colonial territories. The economy is still a post-colonial economy.
Okay.
that is structured and linked to the colonial motherlands. That's why you have the French areas of influence for their ex-colonial possession.
Right.
You have the British areas of influence. And as such, colonialism left militarily, but the economy is there. The political structure that we placed in many of these areas, and I'm saying we, not in a metaphorical way, it is a colonial that often divided these territories on borders to keep minority majority in different countries.
Wow.
And leverage or give power to minorities in those countries so they will constantly be in need of foreign support against the majorities,
Right.
while maintaining the infrastructure of raw material in the hands of the colonial motherlands.
Okay.
So they understand the game. You give the natives a chief from their amongst that
Right.
actually have been educated, economically linked at the hip, politically trained by the colonial structure, and he is there, and all of a sudden you say, well, he's from our own people, but he is more
Becomes an elaborate puppet.
oppressive, knows the inner dynamics of our society, and we can't do much, because if we object to him, then you're objecting toward one of your own chiefs,
Right.
right? And the brutality becomes at the plantation level, and that's why we often focus on the violence at the plantation level, but we never focus at the violence at the master house.
Right.
And the slave master house vis-a-vis the plantation, it's much more sophisticated, it's not as visible.
Right.
And as such, we need to be aware of those dynamics and not be caught in the color of the skin or the identity, but rather look at the politics and the principles and the ethics, political, economic, social,
Right.
and so on. So for us to understand what a post-colonial period looks like and what is a decolonization period, because we have not yet entered into a decolonization period.
And that's real talk there. And as we close, one of the challenges, and I'm going to bring this up with our guests, is looking at how we have a black president
Oh, sure.
and what his stance has been. Because when you go to many of our communities of color, where you got 93% and 80% Muslim and 70% of the brown vote, when you talk to the average person, they're like, we want justice, we want peace, we don't like,
Yes.
oppression. But he has consistently sided with the oppressor in many of these scenarios. And before he got reelected, people excused it and said he's playing the game.
Yes.
But now he's still supporting, and he's already been reelected, which now is making everything come to a hold. Are you with us, or are you on the side? Are you on the side of freedom, or are you on the side of oppression?
Well, I think once again, the race identity card been played, meaning that we identified with the identity, and it's important it is, because it did break what you call a historical barrier toward race consciousness in this country, and I think there's progress in that. However, that progress should not be only at the surface level, and we need to begin to evaluate
Right.
where are we as a movement, where are we as a society, where are we in terms of what we want to see in terms of change. There have been more drone attacks during the Obama presidency than before. We had a list of actually individuals that are to be targeted killing by a constitutional law professor
Right.
that actually commit himself to essentially an assassination list that the United States government is engaged in.
Right, so we have the kill list and record mass deportation.
Record mass deportation, Guantanamo Bay is still functioning. The reauthorization of a form of the Patriot Act that is far more intrusive on
Right.
the American society, and therefore many of us are thinking of hoping for the change, but hope has to be at least matched with deeds that many of us are looking for.
Right.
And I think what we need is to constantly mobilize and not to be comfortable that we broke in the race barrier in the
Right.
sense of the White House, but what we want is not only the race barrier, but we want actually the justice barrier that has to be broken for us to make a
I think
transformation.
that's the key word, the justice barrier. I want to thank you, Hatim,
Thank you
for
Thank
coming
you.
in and sharing with us some thoughts and kind of giving us a grounding in which to have this discussion. I think it's really important that we look at this from another angle and not go along with the neatly packaged and already sanitized version of things, or because it dehumanizes, in my opinion, a large population, and mainly the Palestinians. We don't know names, we don't know tribes, we don't know history. And I could have done a whole show just on that so people get a familiarity, like what are the religions? Is everybody Muslim? You know, it's all these different things that we don't know about, but we have been definitely educated on what goes on with Israel. So I think the colonizing lens is a good one to start with. How can people get
and that's the framework that Malcolm, when he visited Gaza, that's the frame that he identified with, because he visited Gaza in his visit in 1964, and there's a beautiful picture. So his identification was with the colonized people,
right?
And therefore, and that's why he became such a major threat in here, because he was an internationalist, became more so an internationalist,
right?
And as he began to coordinate and link with Nasser, who actually funded his journey, funded his trip, and opened and treated him as a head of state when he visited Egypt. And that's for us to understand these transnational links that predates the modern period. And I think many people don't understand and recognize these transnational movements that had a long duration, long history in its foundation.
And that's literally been erased.
Oh, absolutely.
And very deliberately
because Hollywood wants you to just, to buy the hat with the X and forget what it meant behind it and what the history behind it. So it becomes commodification of our really heroes who came from the ground up and lost their life because they challenged the power structure and they spoke truth to power.
That's real talk. Hatem Bazian, UC Berkeley professor in the Middle East, giving us a history lesson. I want to thank him for coming in. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with our roundtable.
Thank you.
We're back here, Davey D, hanging out with you, and we have an esteemed panel of folks that are going to enlighten us and give us some insight into what is going on in the Middle East conflict, the ongoing conflict, whether they get a ceasefire, whether they get some sort of agreement. The underlying issues are probably not going to be resolved immediately, and we need to look at what's systemic and why it's systemic and who's benefiting from that systemicism, if I can use that word. And so I wanted to talk to some folks who have been on the ground for a very long time in their respective capacities, fighting this fight and bringing and raising awareness to what is going on. One of our guests is Nora. She works for Intifada. Did I pronounce that correct?
Intifada.
Intifada.
Electronic Intifada.
She's a journalist who has been in and out of Palestine a number of times. We also have Lada, who, you want to tell everybody your organization?
I work with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center in San Francisco.
So you're the head honcho now.
That's what they say, yeah.
There you go. Or honches. And then we have Zayed, and your last name and organization.
Ziad Abbas. I am the Associate Director of Middle East Children's Alliance.
Good. Let me start off with you, Nora, in this sense. We were talking about the information age, and I want you to put on your journalist hat. Let's talk about the way the Middle East gets covered a lot. And just even now, just the whole general notion of even wartime coverage. We have people that are embedded. People are flying on the same planes as the aggressors or the policymakers. My own personal experience of being in a crisis situation. We were talking about when I was in London, when they had the bombings there, and how I was with a lot of our colleagues in the mainstream, and how they all were looking for a press release from the police, and they wanted a special treatment from these officials, so they got a very sanitized version versus what did the people on the streets have to say? And so it didn't really matter what the people who experienced and what they went through. They needed to get direction from the police. So it's like you talk to the police, where did the bombs come from? It came from here. Do you know a victim? Sure, we have a couple for you. Here they are. Versus going around and getting real stories. And so that's very minor, but when it comes to the world stage in the Middle East, it's very different types of ways in which it's coverage. I know that you literally, been under fire and stuck there and shot at in the whole nine versus people, as you say, parachute in and parachute out. Take a picture, thumbs up, I'm here in Palestine, I'm here in Tel Aviv, and they're gone. And then they become the experts on a region that they only been there for 2 minutes. And we'll talk a little bit about what you've seen over the years.
And I'm sure Ziad can talk about this too, because
Yes.
he's been a journalist for decades. You know, the whole notion of context and history is always left out when it comes to covering Palestine and Israel's occupation. We hardly even hear the word occupation when when the Middle East is covered. And as you said earlier, you know, Israel is always framed as the victimizers, or the victims, and the Palestinians are the victimizers. You know, if you looked at any of the mainstream media news coverage right now, if you didn't know anything about what was happening, you would think that Palestinians are the invaders, that they were the ones, who are constantly attacking Israel. And it just flips the entire reality on its head. And unfortunately, the corporate news media, especially in the U.S., but in Europe as well, plays into this over and over again. We see, you know, these Western journalists, as you said, parachuting down into Gaza when things are at its most vicious, like they are, you know, over the last week and a half. But
they're not parachuting by themselves.
Right.
They're with tanks,
right.
and they're protected.
They are protected. They're wearing their flak jackets and their helmets, and it's very dramatic. And they're referring to official press releases. They're referring to Israeli officials. They're referring to the bias that their news organization has already set out for them. Meanwhile, as we at the Electronic Intifada have always done, and as independent news media like yourself, like at KPFA and across Pacifica and Free Speech TV, we rely on citizen journalists, on people who are actually there reporting from their actual backyards. And right now there's a plethora of incredibly courageous journalists from Gaza who have been born and raised. Their families have been there for decades. Their families, most of them are refugees from the original expulsion in 1948. And they are the ones doing the work that needs to be done, getting that information out to the rest of the world. And unfortunately, their voices are usually silenced.
Diane, what would you add to this? And forgive me for not recognizing you as a journalist, our senior journalist, but, you know, talk a little bit about coverage and some of the things that you see that are definitely being missed.
Actually, recently, because I'm watching and reading the news coming out from this country and from Palestine and even from Israel. And to be honest here, that the media inside Israel covered what's going on in Gaza Strip better than the media here.
That's right.
That's what I hear.
And even they criticize Israel and they present, I'm not saying they are the best media, but comparing with United States of America or some other TV station or media network, especially in Italy, we call it Rai TV. They call it there Berlusconi Ono, Berlusconi Due, Berlusconi,
Right.
because it's like related to, owned by Berlusconi. They cover like some of the truth happening in the ground. Even you see some pictures coming in the Israeli media and the blogs, the strong pictures which we will never see that in the American media or in certain kind of like TF1 in France or Rai TV in Italy or sometimes BBC. And I can say, like, I was watching CNN, which they have Anderson Cooper inside Gaza, and he has another correspondence in the Egyptian borders and the Israeli side, and you find like 80 to 85% of the news covered, it's Israeli resources.
Right.
And to be honest with you, according to my experience in the ground in Palestine, this is not media or this is not the coverage, it's Hollywood. You feel there's a filmmaker standing behind producing like a film, how they look, what they cover, which kind of words they use. And this is what I call it a brainwash. It's continuous to brainwash the people and keep the people far from the truth.
But now in the age of citizen journalism, where everybody has, a lot of people are using Ustream and, they're getting the word out. We've seen a different type of tactic being used where journalists are now being attacked. We know, like in the Philippines, at one point, journalists were being killed, like I think 50 in 1 month, it's like boom, 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 We just seen in the most recent thing here, where they were bombing buildings where the media was. And so as a journalist, your thoughts on just journalists being attacked, or is this something that has been going on historically and we just didn't see it.
Actually, I was in jail many times because I was working as a journalist.
Wow.
We were suffering a lot, for example, from the censorship. I know that people, they don't know what is the meaning of censorship, but we had the Israeli military censorship, which they need to read and to be sure about each word will be published in the newspaper. Before midnight, you need to transfer all the articles, even the commercials, even the sport coverage, anything to the Israeli military censorship, and they need to give you the stamp. They should stamp the article to be published. And I remember actually in 1988-89, we were 62 Palestinian journalists. We were inside jail because the work we were doing in the first Intifada.
Wow.
And journalists, they are targeted because, to be honest, I can't say there is objective journalism. I am Palestinian before I am a journalist. I am Palestinian refugee. I grew up in a refugee camp before I am as a journalist. So I take a stand because you can't be in the middle between justice and injustice. You need to take a stand as a journalist. But absolutely, you see the journalists, they are targeted everywhere. We saw cameramen, photographers, they were targeted and they were killed. We saw that in the war in Iraq in 2003 when they killed Al Jazeera crew Tariq Ayoub. We lost a friend of us, actually, Noura and I, Mazen Dana, which he survived Palestine. He was injured, shot many times in Hebron city by settlers and by the Israeli army, and he went to cover with Reuters in Baghdad, and he was killed in Baghdad.
He wasn't the one that they showed in the WikiLeaks thing. No.
I
The
don't- I think
WikiLeaks.
that was
Tariq Ayoub,
Ayoub.
actually.
Yeah,
Tariq Ayoub,
but
the
he
one
was-
from Al Jazeera, which
Okay.
But we speak about other friends. He's a local person, and we have other friends. And right now we have Palestinian journalists. They are already in jail, in the Israeli jail.
Wow.
Because it's no matter what you are doing exactly, if you are a Palestinian and you are a journalist, no matter what, even you, if you are taking a stand against injustice, you are targeted. And we saw many journalists, actually, they were shot and they were killed in Palestine or in other areas in the world.
So journalism, we should know when you go around the world, my experience has been it's not an easy job. It's actually a dangerous job when you're really trying to speak truth and get to the story. You're not cheerleading, and I think so much in this country has gotten to be a cheerleading. Can I get access to the president? Can I get a photo shoot with the senator? No, your job is not to get a picture with the president and go eat his shrimp and drink his wine at a state dinner. Your job is to get the story, and a lot of people have abandoned that, and their agencies have abandoned it because there's so much money to be had now, in coming in other forms. Lada, let me ask you this. Change this a little bit. First, I want to find out what your organization does, but just looking at you and seeing that you are young, look young.
What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is, no, a very serious question is that people have said that as we get to younger generations, the opportunity for peace and reconciliation and understanding would be there because people are more open and would reject some of the ways of tradition and some of the ways of elders who may have an axe to grind and use their kids. And do you see there's a bridging of the gap, or have things widened, because the conflict is so ingrained and so steeped, with so much? It's like, I ain't trying to be your friend no matter what.
Yeah, I definitely would say it's widened, and only because so has Israeli aggression, the colonialism has extended on further. Nothing's changed really. And for that reason, these children that are growing up today are growing up in the same environment, whether it's transnationally or locally in Palestine. The connections, are there. So the youth, if you saw them yesterday at the protest, are some of the most vocal people at the demonstration, calling for the end of Zionism, the end of colonialism, really speaking to those issues rather than just talking about the blockade, or rather than just talking about Gaza, because for them it's a broader issue. It's part of their identity, and that's part of who they are. And I think also we have to take into account the 2000 Intifada has also infiltrated the mindsets of youth today. So they grew
Palestinian
up,
youth.
Palestinian youth. So they, we had the 1987 uprising, but then we also had the 2000 uprising, and there's a whole generation of youth that grew up with that mindset and that framework.
Well, with that in mind, does those sort of experiences now make it a priority to connect with similar struggles around the world, around the globe, and how easy is it for those struggles to be linked? You know, for example, we see so many people who've been displaced and have been terrorized in Latin America, you know, right south of our border. Is there a connection, and are there conversations going on there? Here in the States, you know, you have everything from your Occupy movements to your anti-police brutality movements, you know. I know in Oakland we made that connection with the Oscar Grant situation and struggles in Palestine, which enraged people. Like, how dare you link this? But that's where it seems like the strength is when we start to connect these dots. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where we're trying to head towards. You know, the experience of youth here today naturally should go in that direction. They're growing up with other youth of color who go through similar experiences, whether it's in the classroom or in the street or in the community. And so that sense of marginalization naturally brings in a sense of unity. But there's also, you know, to be real, there's a divisiveness that, you know, that's definitely part of the communities here in society in the United States and how it divides youth of color in particular.
Right.
But recently, you know, there's been a shift in that, in the sense that people are making those connections because the connection is there, especially when it comes to Israel and police brutality. I mean, the Oakland police was being trained in Israel 2 weekends ago.
That's right.
And, you know, the tear gas that's being used is U.S. made, and all these connections.
And the border wall.
And the border and the walls. I mean, that's obviously an indigenous connection as well. The indigenous people of Palestine and the indigenous people here. So these are connections that are really clear, and we don't even have to make them. They're there. It's just a matter of raising the level of awareness and also making that part of the norm, where the conversation isn't just had within a Palestinian community, but involving other folks as well.
How do you really, you know, solidify those connections, knowing that, you know, once people see these connections historically, there have been all kind of forces to disrupt and distract and to tank them. You know, plant seeds, like, you know, don't hang out with those Arab people, you know, don't hang out with these, you know, I mean, you have people that come and put that in there to keep things divided. From your standpoint, you know, how do you feel coalitions in these similar types of struggles and the resistance that is coming out from so many places, how do you keep that really stoked and intact?
I think it has to move beyond the activists, right? So in coalition building, it's often just the leaders of different organizations and nonprofits, and you sit together and we're all like-minded and we agree and we move forward with events, right? But actually involving the bases in that process, having the youth come through to meetings, being part of the political education and the forums, and also having youth exchanges. I know AROC, you know, we've been working with different organizations locally to build those bridges with other youth organizations in particular, so that we have these natural exchanges taking place and where they're experiencing not only political education together, but just also cultural resistance and empowerment here in the U.S. and finding a sense of relationship building that actually leads to more changes in the long term.
You know, one of the key battlegrounds around trying to raise awareness, get people conscious, has been in the classroom, both on the elementary level, where textbooks are now being rewritten, with history being moved out, to the college level, where many professors who have expressed any sort of sympathy, you know, or I wouldn't even say sympathy, just, you know, have been empathetic towards Palestinians in any sort of way, have found themselves like, we need to make sure they don't get tenured. We need to take them out. That battleground, can we talk a little bit about that and what's that looking like? And I'll start off with you, Nora, because, you know, you just recently covered, you know, situation down at UC Irvine with that had very chilling effects, you know, with the Irvine 10.
Yeah. And the Irvine 10, or the Irvine 11 as it's
Irvine 11.
called, is in 2010, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, came to UC Irvine to really, he was on a speaking tour around the country to defend Israel's policies in Gaza, specifically 2 years or a year and a half after the Israeli attacks on Gaza. That was called Operation Cast Lead, in which 1,400 Palestinians were killed, including 300 children. Tens of thousands of homes and schools and hospitals were all demolished. And Michael Oren was trying to drum up support for Israel, especially in academic institutions. And so 11 students from UC Irvine decided to hold a vocal, nonviolent, civil disobedient protest inside the auditorium where Michael Oren was speaking. They all happened to be of Muslim faith, these 11 students, and they were all arrested by UC Irvine police. And then, not only did the University of California administration punish them, and they put the Muslim Student Union on probation for a while, but they also, the Orange County District Attorney's Office then took it upon themselves to launch a prosecution against these 11 students, charging them with misdemeanor counts of disrupting a meeting, a charge that hadn't been used in California since the 1970s. So it was a targeted attack, basically to send a message against these students that you do not have the right to free speech, and that this administration and the county, as a political entity, will defend a foreign state, and not the citizens who live in that county.
Right. It seems like it went beyond freedom of speech.
That's right.
That the message being sent is that you don't want to cross this line.
That's right.
You don't want to say anything that would even be remotely conceived as being offensive to this group of people.
Right.
And I say that in this, understanding that we've seen that there have been on campuses disruptions when the Tea Party had issues, say, with healthcare and all these other things. And in fact, it's been applauded as, these are passionate,
Right.
highly politicized folks who want to,
Yeah.
exercise democracy at its finest.
That's right.
Except when you start challenging systems of oppression. Then it becomes, a freedom of speech violation, and let's go through the record books and all that. But, because freedom of speech, and we've seen so many outrageous things said on campuses all around this country, this couldn't have been a free speech thing as much as it was like, if you're teaching, don't even go there. If you're a student, don't even write there.
It's a criminalization
Right.
of Palestinian activism is
That's
what
right.
it is. It's not about free speech, because obviously free speech is relative to whoever is enforcing it.
Right.
When there's racist people, attacking youth of color, that's free speech. Whereas when Palestinians are organizing on campus, that's hate speech. And
Right.
so we have to also put that in perspective, even with the muni bus ads that were running around San Francisco.
What are the muni bus ads for people who don't know?
The San Francisco muni bus ads had ads that were calling Palestinians and Muslim savages, right? And these were sponsored by a very right-wing, conservative, and racist organization. And the ads were going around the city on a regular basis, and there was uproar from the community about these ads. And rather than take them down, the city put a disclaimer saying on the other side of the bus saying that these ads don't have anything to do with San Francisco Muni, TransUnion, the union.
So people are being, seeds are being planted.
Seeds have been planted, and I think the free speech argument is also being used against us on a regular basis. So it really comes back down to reframing the whole argument outside of free speech. It's
Right.
really about the criminalization of a particular community at this point, and it's the Palestinian community. Acknowledging and recognizing that this didn't start with us.
Right.
There's been other communities that have gone through this way far beyond us. And
Which
right
is
now,
important, which is why it's important to make those connections.
Exactly. So, with HR 35, they're literally criminalizing Palestinian activism on campus.
What is HR 35 for people who don't know?
Any anti-Israel activism on campus is deemed anti-Semitic, and therefore hate speech and hate crimes can be used in that form as well.
It is a resolution that the California State Assembly passed a couple of months ago.
Anonymously,
Yeah.
because people were afraid
Yeah.
to go against it. Because I know people that's
Absolutely.
like, well, I don't want to go with it, but you know how it is. No, I don't know how it is.
That's the climate that professors are operating within. That's the climate that students are operating within, and so that really changes the whole dynamic of
So if you go into a
educational
classroom, you
institutions.
can't talk about this conflict without risking being deemed
Exactly.
somebody who's hateful.
Mhm.
Wow. Diane, if you could, look at this through the lens of history, what lessons do you think younger generations today need to really understand in terms of moving forward in solid coalition building? What sort of things we should collectively be pushing for, to avoid pitfalls that might have happened in the past, when people have attempted and just didn't have all their I's and T's, crossed and dotted.
Yeah, I think the most important right now for the new generation is to go back to the roots of them, of the human being needs, and peace and justice and to learn about that. And this actually, I refer that to the Howardism, when we go back to the history, how we need to read the history, who's writing the history. And the new generation actually need to learn very well about critical thinking, not to take the things as it is and live with it. It reminds me, like with my life, I grew up in a refugee camp and I attended the United Nations school. So I was reading the curriculums and the education system related, controlled by Israeli occupation, and it's like implemented by United Nations. So in our class we were reading, when I was young, Columbus discovered America, Columbus discovered America. And this is the way how we educated. When I went to jail for the first time, I was young, I find out that Columbus did not discover America. And this is where you find it, like, for example, in jail, not inside the school.
Right.
And this is sometimes how things can come to the
Right,
people,
but we
to
shouldn't
the
have
new
to go to jail
generation.
to learn this, though.
Actually,
you went
learned
to jail so that you could tell us that you need to think critically.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I learned English inside jail.
Okay.
Because we teach each other, we learned a lot about many other issues inside the world. And I see the new generation, actually, they are occupied. I walk here in, like, around UC Berkeley, and you find the new generation with their headphones, with this digital stuff, and they can communicate only through tools. The human communication is getting less, and their connection with the history, I think, it's very limited.
Yeah.
And just they need to pass the exam. Yesterday we were like in this demonstration, and I was like watching, and the people like in the Palestinian side, which there are hundreds, and I was looking to the other side, who pro-Israel, they were like maybe 25, 30 people. And one of the people, he came to me and he asked me, actually he's young, he told me, did you notice something there in the other side? I looked, I told him, not much, I couldn't.
Right.
He told me, you see all of them white, all of them like they are like the Tea Party. Of course, it's like a joke, and
Right.
he told me, look here. I told him, you know what? It's normal. It's normal for this side where you see the diversity and you see people coming from different background. And he told me, this is the history, how it comes, the people coming together. And I can see the new generation, they can build huge connections
Right.
with the history, rooted the struggle, not just for Palestine. I'm not speaking just about Palestine.
Right.
Our struggle, it's not separate from the other people's struggles, even from Auckland here, even from LA, from about the wall, you mentioned about the wall, even from the beginning, how the myth it was used, the manifest destiny
Right.
in this country, and the Israelis, they used the promised land. God promised them this land. And sometimes you think that God sat down in the office and he has his own computer and like real estate agent dividing lands to the people and punishing other people. I think the new generation, we're still counting on the new generation, and I can see, at least
Right.
in my part of the part of our world, we saw the new generation, the Arab world, how they come and they change in a way or another, they change this reality. We saw this kind of power, like they break down the fear
Right.
to take the street. And actually 3 days ago, there were hundreds of Egyptian youth. They crossed the borders.
That's
They
right.
know Gaza under attack. They crossed borders and they went to Gaza to be in solidarity. And this is something like you can count on the new generation.
And when those things happen, that's when they become scary. And I mean, for people in power, because they don't want folks to be comparing notes and go, wait a second, same people did this to you that's doing this to me. Let's share resources. Let's build community. I think building community and the potential to build it is the most frightening thing for people in power that have become powerful by dividing and conquering people. Let me get ready to close out, and I want each of y'all to take a moment and give us something that really stands out for you in this conflict that we can learn from. That you want to leave us with, that we go, you know what? Let me build on that, and I'll start off with you, Nora.
On the spot. I think that the fact that so much is happening to counteract the big lies and Israel's ongoing assaults and the way that it enacts policy against Palestinians and other people in the region. I think that the grassroots is growing. especially in activism circles when we talk about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, where people are circumventing, their governments, appealing to their senators or their local congresspeople and saying, we're going to take action ourselves. If you're not going to challenge, Israel's alliance with the U.S., then we're going to challenge it ourselves. So we have student groups, making sure that their student bonds and their teachers' pension funds aren't being funneled towards companies that are profiting from Israel's ongoing occupation and settler colonialism. We have activism groups all over the United States and in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, Australia. So all the continents are coming together. People taking action, standing out in front of stores and making sure that stores de-shelve products that are coming from Israeli settlements or from Israel itself. The thing is that people do have power, and we have to remember that we have the power to change things, just like how apartheid in South Africa fell because of the students, because of the boycott movements, because of the divestment and sanctions movements. We have the same capacity and capabilities to do that today, and it's working. And it's the Israeli government is scared because it's working so well and so quickly.
So people power.
That's right.
All right. And then I just want to thank our other guest, Hatem Bazian, for coming on and, giving us some historic perspective as well. Want to thank you all for listening. Raise your consciousness, react, reflect, and keep building. And I want to thank everybody. We're out for now. Peace.
Thank you.